Good to see you guys. Thanks for being here on a Wednesday night. Thoroughly enjoying this study. One of the fun things that I love about being able to teach is being able to learn so much, because I get to spend hours a week digging and reading, and I feel like every week I'm like, wow, this is cool. The Bible is much cooler than I ever thought it was, and I just keep relearning that again and again. Wanted to also draw your attention to there's a number of classes that are starting up. One in particular I really want you to consider going to is Practicing the Way. My friend John right here is going to be one of the co-leaders of that class on Sunday mornings. It's a fabulous study. I would highly encourage you to be there. Give it a try. Come on Sunday morning. Is it this Sunday, John, that we're starting? Okay. In room... Well, it's on it's in the bulletin. You've got it there. 202. Okay, good. Thanks for doing that, John. We're in this series, week 3, called The Bible That Jesus Read, focusing on the Old Testament. And the kind of repeated goal that we've said multiple times in this series is that we as followers of Jesus would see greater continuity between our Old and New Testaments. We would see it is one cohesive story, one narrative, and we oftentimes feel like, man, these are two separate books. In fact, there was an ancient heresy called Marcionism. In the early church, this guy Marcion, he saw such discontinuity that he said, you know what, the God of the Old Testament, he's actually a different God. And he said, I reject all of that. And he said, but there's a new God in the New Testament. And Marcionism pops its head up every once in a while in church history. It seems to continually do that. So one of our goals is to, again, see this as one continuous story. And so week 1, we talked about this idea that the revealed gospel was in the Old Testament, but it was hidden in plain sight. It wasn't really until post-resurrection that the first followers of Jesus were able to even see this gospel story, what God had planned. Week 2, we started looking at what seems to be almost a divine contradiction. You can't see the face of God and live. It says all throughout the Old Testament. And yet almost every people I have an encounter with God, and we said it's not only not bad, it's wonderful. They typically receive a blessing as a result of it. And so we saw this idea that what the Bible is presenting is there's one solution to that. You can't see the face of God and live. And that is that if God is mediated to us through a human face, a human theophany, an appearance of God in human form, and we saw that's kind of setting up a pattern. So therefore, as I'm reading the story, I'm supposed to see, God shows up a lot as a man, taking on this form. And we looked at some of these different titles for God when he shows up that way. And so this week, this is sort of a part 2 from last week. We're going to get into the weeds. We're going to get into a lot of passages that talk about God in really unique ways that you may have never really noticed before. But again, it's setting a pattern. It's creating an expectation to the reader. That as they're reading this story, they're going, I bet that's going to be important. I bet that's going to be fulfilled in some way even. So I want us to examine what are some of the most dramatic divine appearances in the Old Testament, where God shows up face to face and meets somebody, actually gets down in the dirt, literally in one case, and wrestles. So a couple case studies. First one's Jacob. You know this name? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These are the 3 great patriarchs. And Jacob has this interesting encounter. This is in Genesis chapter 32, verse 22. We'll read the passage here in a second. Jacob has been a pretty rotten guy for most of his life. He gets his name from how he was born. He has a twin brother. Both of them are in the womb together. And whichever one comes out first, that's considered the eldest child. They get twice the blessing, all that sort of thing. Well, Esau, his brother, comes out first. But as he's delivered, there's a tiny little pink hand grabbing Esau's heel, and it's Jacob. And so they actually call him heel grabber. That's what Jacob means. But it's kind of a play on words because it also means someone who trips other people up or someone who deceives. And of course, he plays into that name very nicely throughout his life. He's constantly deceiving people. God has for him to get the blessing, but Jacob doesn't sort of wait upon God. He manipulates for it as a result. So this is, he's manipulated his brother. He hasn't seen his brother Esau in like 20 years, but he knows his brother probably wants to kill him. And Jacob is walking with his family and all his possessions coming back to the homeland, and he sees his brother. He knows his brother's coming. He's told that he's coming. So he goes, okay, I'll at least separate my stuff. That way some of it will live on. If he takes all this stuff, that will still be around for my family and that sort of thing. And so this is what we read, Genesis chapter 32, verse 22. The same night, he arose, he took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And there's this interesting statement, and Jacob was left alone. It's late at night. He's totally alone, probably fearful that his life might end by his brother the next day. And then we read this interesting, bizarre part of the story. A man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, it's kind of an interesting detail, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, this is the man, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But deceiver said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Deceiver, heel grabber." Then he said, "Well, your name shall no longer be called heel grabber, deceiver, but wrestles with God." That's what Israel means. You're one who wrestles with God. "For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, which means the face of God, the face of El, saying, "For I have seen," remember the kind of the contradictory thing we stumbled across last week, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." So interesting account what we have here. What's interesting is Jacob somehow realizes this is not an ordinary person. And there's a fascinating detail that scholars and commentators have sort of been puzzled by. As it says, he strove with him, but he didn't beat him. He couldn't beat him, right? And they go, wait, why? If this was just merely, let's say, an angelic being with full angelic powers, he'd destroy him in a matter of seconds, right? If he's mere man, it wouldn't go on. It's like this being intentionally limits his strength. Because at any second, he just touched his hip at the end, and he could have done that any second, but he intentionally limits his own strength. What does that sound like? In the incarnation, we have Jesus not like Superman pretending to be Clark Kent. He's living an actual, fully human life. He doesn't access his divine knowledge. Remember, he says, no one knows the coming of the Son of Man, not even me. I don't know it. He limits his own power. He's tempted by Satan. Throw yourself down. Turn these stones into bread. He could do it like this, but he goes, no. I'm going to live a fully dependent life on the Father. There's no tricks here. I'm living an actual human life. So we see kind of the seeds of something along those lines, of the self-limiting of this being who is wrestling with him. And then the real identity is revealed. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and men and have prevailed. And then, of course, he says, I have seen God face to face. It's interesting. Sometime later, many centuries later, there was a prophet by the name of Hosea. And Hosea was reflecting back upon this story right here. And this is what he says in Hosea chapter 12, verse 3. He says, in the womb, he took his brother by the heel. Do we know who that is? Jacob, right? In the womb, he took his brother by the heel. And in his manhood, he strove or wrestled with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. Do you see how this author Hosea, he's using this angel and God like interchangeably? That's how he's identifying. And that's what we're going to see constantly. We're going to go through a number of passages here. That biblical authors will use the angel of the Lord and Yahweh himself and just interchangeably go back and forth as they speak about them, as they speak about God. And I think this tells us something about God's character, that God doesn't just govern from a distance. God, he comes close. I think it's Eugene Peterson's message, paraphrase version of the Bible, where he says, God moved into the neighborhood when he speaks about the incarnation. God moves into the neighborhood of his human family. We have a God who, though he is transcendent, he makes himself immanent. He doesn't just, what's that old Bette Midler song? He's watching us from a distance or something like that. It's so unbiblical. He's not watching us from a distance. This is a God who moves into the neighborhood. Even pre-incarnation in the Old Testament, he comes close. He wrestles with this guy in the dirt as he's engaging with them. He gets personally messy. And as we think about our own emotional struggles, this is one of the conceptions or images of God that I am most taken by. The idea that God would wrestle with us, because I think oftentimes I'm confused because of maybe suffering that I'm encountering, someone I love is encountering. I'm oftentimes kind of discombobulated because of doubt, so many different things. And we have a God who doesn't say, well, snap out of it, shape up. Instead, he says, do you need to wrestle with me? Maybe that's what you need. Maybe you're at a place, a season where you'd even say, I'm struggling with some doubt or difficulty, whatever it might be. I'm kind of angry at God. God doesn't say, don't you dare be angry at me. He says, well, maybe you need a wrestling match. Maybe you need to grapple with me. That's the character of this God of the Bible, and I absolutely love that. Okay, second case study, Moses. Moses, if you've been here on the weekends, you know that we've been going through the book of Exodus. In fact, I think it was just this last week that Pastor Aaron was talking about Moses in the burning bush. Wasn't that this last weekend, if you were here? Moses, of course, grows up for 40 years in the Egyptian palace. He's forced to leave. He runs to the desert of Midian. He's there for sort of the second part of his life, second two-thirds of his life, another 40 years. He's now 80 years old. He is shepherding his father-in-law's sheep out in the desert. And he comes to a mountain, and of course he sees this bush that seems to be on fire but not consumed. And he's intrigued, so he goes over to it, and this is the account that we have. And again, look for details. Details are really important. This is Exodus chapter 3. Read verses 1 through 6. Now, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Verse 2, the angel of the Lord, or of Yahweh, appeared. That means he saw him. If something appears to you. He appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. All right, so who's in the bush? Angel of the Lord, okay? He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When Yahweh saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him from where? Out of the bush. I thought the angel of the Lord was in the bush. God calls out from the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet. Now again, store these things away because we're going to get to other stories that it's going to loop into, it's going to hook into some of the vocabulary, and you're supposed to think back to it. Take off your shoes because the place in which you were standing, it's holy ground, sacred space, that is. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of, oh, there's the heel grabber guy there. Moses hides his face because he was afraid to look at God, because he knows you can't look at God and not be consumed, not die. Again, notice of the language, the angel of the Lord, verse 2, appears to him, and yet Yahweh himself, verse 4, speaks to him, and he says, I am the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. So here's the pattern, and we'll see this again and again. The angel of Yahweh appears, but he is Yahweh. The invisible God makes himself visible and audible through this mysterious figure, the angel of the Lord. And then, of course, the holy ground. The very first commandment Moses is given, take your sandals off your feet, for the place you're standing is holy. Angels never, ever, throughout Scripture, make space or geography sacred. Never happens. Only God. When God shows up, it's this idea that, oh, this is sacred space now because he is in that. So this command, take your shoes off, it's a theological statement about the one who's in the bush. This is Yahweh himself, the angel of the Lord. I think that's what's so cool, just when I think about this account, is how God shows up not only in temples. God shows up in really ordinary places in our lives. And then this pointless bush on this mountain becomes really the launching pad for the exodus from Egypt. And as followers of Jesus, I think it's important for us to kind of realize that God doesn't just show up in cathedrals. Everywhere a believer goes is sacred space by virtue of the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. Everywhere you go, that space is transformed into sacred space, which actually I think has something to say about mission. Wherever you go, you're sent. Think about it that way. Everywhere you go, you're sent. Even if it seems to be on accident, you're sent there. Why is that? Because you're bringing the presence of God with you. You're creating sacred space in your workplace, in your school, in your family. Paul riffs on this all the time where he says things like, don't defile your body. He said, do you know why? Because it's God's temple. It's like sacred space. You don't treat sacred space that way. So I think it does have something to do with mission. It's interesting, if we jump over to the New Testament, you remember this guy Stephen? He's the first martyr, really. Stephen is martyred by the religious leaders, and in Acts chapter 7, he goes on this long story to the religious leaders saying, let me tell you your history as Israelites. And he tells this long story, and then he gets stoned right away afterwards when he's done telling it. But when he's talking about back the account of this Mount Horeb, he does the exact same thing, Stephen. He uses the angel of the Lord and God, and he just keeps doing this as he's telling the story. This is how Stephen understood the story too. Listen to Acts chapter 7, verse 30 through 38. Now, when 40 years had passed, he says, an angel appeared to him, that's Moses, in the wilderness of Mount Sinai, in a flame of fire in a bush. When Moses saw it, he was amazed at the sight, and he drew near to look. There came the voice of the Lord. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and of Jacob. And Moses trembled and did not dare look. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals, for where you're standing is holy ground. I'll jump down to verse 35. This Moses, who they rejected, saying, who made you a ruler or a judge? This man God sent as both ruler and redeemer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. And then verse 37, do you see what he's doing? He's just swapping these terms. The way Stephen understood this story in Exodus is the same way we're reading it and understanding it. That this angel of the Lord and Yahweh are almost like indistinguishable from each other. This angel Lord is Yahweh. Another question as we think about the Exodus. Who brought Israel out of Egypt? Well, let's go to a couple different places here. Indeed. Exodus chapter 33, verse 14. This is interesting. Moses is on Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. He's speaking to Yahweh. And he says, Yahweh says, verse 14, this is Exodus 33, 14. He said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And then, of course, Moses says, and he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up out of here. So what delivered Israel out of Egypt? The presence of God. Okay, that's what we know. We go to another place, 1 Samuel 10:18, and we read this. And he said to the people of Israel, thus says, here's the covenant name, Yahweh, Lord, the God of Israel, I brought you up out of Egypt and delivered you. So who delivered him according to this passage? Yahweh. Before it was his presence. Here it's Yahweh. And then if we go to Exodus chapter 14, verse 19, we read this. Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. This is, they're at the Red Sea, okay? And it says they're following this person, this angel of the Lord, and then they stop. He actually moves around behind them and guards them from the Egyptians, we're told. So who delivered them from Egypt? Yahweh, the presence, the angel of the Lord. Who is that? Well, listen to how one New Testament author, Jude, thought of it. Jude chapter, verse 5. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. Who delivered Israel from Egypt? Yahweh, this angel of the Lord character, who according to Jude, that was Jesus who did that. And New Testament biblical authors are constantly hooking back into the story to say that's who that was. This kind of mystical character, this guy who shows up. Let's take a closer look at this angel, okay, this guy, because he's different than all other angelic beings that we see. Before we do that, let me say something about this. In Judaism, there's something called the name theology. I have this in your vocabulary words there. If you speak to a observant Jew, they will probably not say the name Yahweh. Roughly around sometime 1st century BC, it became a common practice, it wasn't originally, to not utter the name Yahweh because it's so holy, and what if they misused it? And so instead, they would replace it with Hashem, just means the name. And so when they say the name, it's the same thing as referring to him, okay? So for instance, Psalms, we see this, Psalm chapter 20, verse 1, we read this. May Yahweh answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. Now, that doesn't mean there's anything mystical about, like, you write in the ground YHWH, like this name's going to protect us, these 4 consonants. No. To refer to the name is the same thing as referring to him. You with me on that? So the name theology, again, it's very developed in Scripture. Do you know that? We used to sing a song. Do you remember that song? If you grew up in church, you'd say, some trust in chariots, some in horses, but I will trust in the name of the Lord our God, meaning I'll trust in him. So the name just means him, okay? Okay, important. Now let's go to, this is, I think, such a fascinating passage. Going back to Exodus, God's speaking to Moses and the Israelites, and they're going to be traveling out into the desert. They're going to the promised land. But before they go, this is what God says to them. Exodus chapter 22, verse 20. It says, behold, I send an angel who's going to walk before you. What's he going to do? Well, he's going to guard you on the way to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Now listen to this. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. That means he's talking to them. He's telling them things. Obey his voice. Do not rebel against him. Why not? Because he will not pardon your transgression. For, look what it says, my name is in him. Your name? Well, the name is you, right? I'm in him. You ever recall Jesus saying something like, I am in the Father, the Father's in me? Do you remember times where Jesus said, Lord, I have shown to them your name, or I've revealed to them your... He's not saying, you'll never guess what his name is. You know, it's Elvis. No, he's saying, I've showed them who you are. I've shown them the name. I've shown them Yahweh. And of course, last week we looked at some of those passages where Jesus is speaking to doubting Thomas, right? And he goes, Jesus, show us the way. He goes, have I been with you that long? And he goes, okay, show us the Father. And he goes, you've known me. If you know me, you know the Father. This is the theology he's drawing from, is this Old Testament theology, that the name was in this being here who led them out of Egypt. Okay, third case study. This is kind of a cool one. Joshua. Moses has died. The person who follows up Moses' leadership is Joshua. They are going to finally get into the promised land. They've been wandering for 40 years because of Israel's disobedience. And they're going to get in, but right before they get in, they run into this massive city called Jericho. Huge fortress. Jericho had two separate walls. The first wall was about 6 feet deep, wide. Then there was another wall right behind it that was 12 feet, probably about 30 feet tall. So going after this is like going after something, with like a slingshot. There's really no hope in defeating that in and of themselves. So let's go to this passage. Joshua is probably, he's probably walking around. He's doing reconnaissance, strategy planning, maybe a little bit of pre-battle anxiety. And then we read this interesting passage. Joshua chapter 5, verse 13 through 15. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and he looked, and behold, a man was standing before him. Here's a key phrase: with his drawn sword in his hand. Put that phrase away somewhere. Okay, that's important. With his drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" I love this answer. No. He said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of Yahweh. I'm the one in charge. I lead all of the hosts of Yahweh's army." Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth. What does it say? Worshipped him. Okay? Now, every single time in Scripture, when a mere angel is worshipped, do you know what the angel always says? You can go to Revelation 19:10. You can go to Revelation 22:9. Every time an angel is worshipped, they recoil. And they say, "Don't worship me. I'm just a servant." Only worship the Most High God. Every angel who's on God's payroll does that, okay? What does this man do here? He accepts the worship. Well, who could that possibly be? And then Joshua says, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of Yahweh's army said to Joshua, what does this make you think of? Take off your sandals from your feet. The place you are standing is holy ground. What does that sound like? Yeah, that's Moses on Mount Sinai. What makes this holy? Well, Yahweh himself must be there if it's holy ground, because no one else makes ground holy. Who's this man? Well, I mean, all of these ideas, like this matrix of ideas, you're supposed to be like connecting dots and going, man, this is not a normal man. This is the commander, the leader of Yahweh's forces. He heads it all up. There's an interesting passage, so fascinating. In Exodus chapter 15, there's a song that's being sung about God delivering Israel from Egypt, okay? Song, beautiful song. And in the middle of the song, verse 3, this is Exodus chapter 15, verse 3. Look what it says. Yahweh is a man of war. What? Yahweh's God. Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh is his name. Do you see how these ancient people, who they're thinking this character is, this man of war, this commander of the Lord's armies, this angel of the Lord? Who is he? Well, he's Yahweh himself, the visible presence of Yahweh. Now, as I mentioned, this phrase, this phrase in Joshua chapter 5, verse 13 that we were just at, where it says, he saw a man standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. You might think, well, it's tons of people who have a drawn sword in their hand, right? Yeah. But the way this is phrased, this exact language, it's only used 3 times in the Old Testament, where it speaks of someone with a drawn sword in their hand. That exact phrase, it's used 3 times. One here is Joshua with this man who, connecting back to the bush, because it says, take your shoes off. The other 2 times, you remember the guy Balaam, and he's got a donkey? Remember that dude? And his donkey stops, and then this is what we read. This is Numbers chapter 22, verse 23. And the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road, look, with a drawn sword in his hand. Like, it only used 3 times, so it's tapping into vocabulary to make you connect to these things. Only other one, third one, is when David does something evil, King David, I think it's the census, and what we read is, and David lifted his eyes, and he saw the angel of Yahweh standing between earth and heaven with a drawn sword in his hand. So you're supposed to make all these connections and go, it's this guy again. He keeps showing up, and he is Yahweh, but he's distinct from from Yahweh, but he is Yahweh, and they're doing theology like we're doing theology. How do we understand the Trinity? Jesus is God, but he's not the Father, and sends the Spirit, and yet sometimes it's called the Spirit of Jesus, and and they're going like this. You go, man, it's hard to wrap my mind around it. I know. Same for the Old Testament authors, as they're thinking about who is this God, the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac. Let's catch just a couple quick glimpses. We said this one who's a couple times identified not as the angel of the Lord, but the commander of the armies of Yahweh, right? That's a title that's given to him. Take a look just at a couple of these glimpses of God's armies, his hosts. There are a couple times where they sort of surface. This is Daniel chapter 7, verse 10. Daniel has a vision of God's sacred space, the throne. And he says, a stream of fire issued and came out from before him. And thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the court sat in judgment. That means there's other supernatural beings there who this is God's divine counsel. He's tasked them with certain duties. This particular group, they're part of his court. But it describes it so whoever this character is, he leads all of those guys. He's in charge. He can, you remember when Satan said to Jesus, he said, cast yourself down from the, was it the temple or a mountain? I can't remember. He says, cast yourself down and remember what he says? You can command the legions of angels to protect you. Why can he do that? Because he's the commander of the Lord's army. And Satan knows that. He said, you can just tell me exactly what to do. These 10,000s upon 10,000s. Do you remember when in the garden, Peter pulls out his sword and he cuts off Malchus's ear? And you remember what Jesus says? He goes, put it away. If I wanted, I could command the legions in heaven to come wipe these guys out with a snap of a finger. Why can I do that? Because I am the commander of Yahweh's armies. He's making that claim constantly all the time here. Or let's see, that was Daniel. Let's go to, did I skip that one? Do you remember Elijah and his servant? This is 2 Kings 6:17. Elijah is a prophet. Some foreign army is coming against Israel, and Elijah's servant is just freaked out. He's so scared. He's like, we're dead. There's no way we're going to live. And what Elijah says, he prays to Yahweh. Then Elijah, this is verse 17. Then Elisha prayed. He said, oh, Yahweh, please open his eyes that he may see. So Yahweh opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So he sort of says, can he see into the unseen realm for a second? Allow him to see these hosts, the 10,000s upon 10,000s that the commander of the Lord's army, he controls, he sends them, he commissions them, and he gets a glimpse of it. There's one other one, which is a throne room scene, and this will link us to something in the New Testament that I think is really key. This is Isaiah chapter 6. You probably know this story. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1. He says, in the year that King Uzziah died, listen to this, he said, I saw the Lord. I saw God. I saw Yahweh sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. And he says, above him stood the seraphim. Seraphim are throne guardians. You can look up Egyptian seraphim. It'll kind of pull up what they were thought of in the ancient world. He saw seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet. And with 2 he flew. And one called to the other. So they're speaking back and forth to each other. Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of his hosts. I mean, Yahweh who is in charge of all of his hosts, all of his armies. The whole earth is full of his glory. It says, and the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And he has this response, oh man, I've seen God, I'm hosed, I'm done. He goes, woe is me, I'm lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh, who's in charge of his armies, his Yahweh of the hosts. Okay? Amazing scene, right? You know what's so interesting? Jesus' closest disciple, John, when John's thinking about this passage in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1, the temple's filled with his glory, smoke, and all this stuff, he says, Isaiah said these things because he saw his, in context, it's Jesus. He saw Jesus' glory and spoke of him. What John's saying is that visible representation of the invisible Yahweh that had all this glory, that was Jesus pre-incarnation. It's absolutely amazing, this vision that he has. And Isaiah witnessed Yahweh's glory in the temple, and it's the same divine figure who appeared in the bush to Moses. It's the same divine figure who wrestles with Jacob in the dust by the Jabbok River. And it's the same one who stood before Joshua with a drawn sword in his hand and said, take off your sandals because I'm holy. I make this place holy. This was the eternal Son making himself visible before the incarnation. This is where Trinitarian theology comes from. Again, I know I've said this before, but it's important because oftentimes the accusation is, these New Testament writers, they're just making stuff up out of whole cloth, especially about Jesus being divine and he being the one unique Son that is in charge of all the other sons, so to speak. That's just good Old Testament theology. New Testament writers, they're reading the Bible that Jesus read. They're reading the Old Testament as they're thinking about, so this Jesus, when he claimed all those things, that was him. They're reading their Old Testament like out of excitement, going, we were with that guy for 3 years. And this was him there, and this was him there, and this is him showing up there. He almost killed David. They're doing theology from the Bible that Jesus read. And for me, that's an encouragement, because I'm like, that means I should probably be doing theology from the Bible that Jesus read as well, because it's the gospel concealed, revealed in the New Testament. So let me just make a couple kind of points of application here as we kind of wind some of this down. When I think about the story with Jacob, as I mentioned earlier, when fear and doubt and circumstances that are absolutely out of our control, we serve a God who invites the wrestle, who invites a struggle. God's okay, and we said this earlier, God's okay with you struggling in your faith with him. He's okay with you struggling with difficult questions that you can't seem to get answered and frustrations with him. That's what a good father does. A good father invites the pushback, all right? He's the perfect father. He's okay with that because every single one of us, I believe, will, if you haven't yet, that's amazing. You will one day. Struggle with fear and doubt and circumstances that are beyond your control, and you'll be a little irked at Yahweh because he's not doing what you want. Why wouldn't you just obey me, God? And so he says, well, I'm a God who am okay with the pushback. I'm okay with the struggle. And again, that to me, I'm interested in that. I'm intrigued by a God who doesn't just tell me submit. The word Islam means just obey, submit. The name Israel means wrestle with God. I'm intrigued by that. I think a second thing is the idea that ordinary places, when we think about Moses being on the mountain in Midian, ordinary places can be transformed like that into sacred locations, sacred moments. At your kitchen table, when you're just speaking to the Lord, your commute that you're making as you're just communing with him, the workplace, all of these things become sacred ground. And we talked a little bit about that earlier, because you have the Spirit of God. And your ability to commune with the commander of the Lord's hosts through the Spirit, just any second, any minute, just with a thought. The commander of the Lord's host, drawn sword in his hand, that guy, he is immediately there. In fact, we're told he's interceding on our behalf right now to the Father, constantly interceding for us, and promises to return. This burning bush idea is it's such a great picture, but there's a there's a poet, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Barron Browning, and in one of her books, she's talking about this reality of God's presence being everywhere. And she has this great line. She says, every bush is a burning bush that's crowded with God. Every bush is a burning bush in a world that's crowded with God. Do you realize we live in a world crowded with God? I mean, this room, because you're all here, if you're a follower of Jesus, this room is crowded with God's presence through his Holy Spirit. And if I looked at my life like every bush is a burning bush in a world that's crowded with God, I wonder how differently I would live. I wonder how differently I would approach circumstances. Like we said earlier, everywhere you go, you're sent. That means there's a burning bush there. There's some way in which you can encounter God. The Saint Jesus, who would be born in Bethlehem, was already seeking relationship with his people for centuries before that. And it tells me that this is a God who insists on coming close. He insists on coming close. Next week, we're going to look at how all of these encounters, and we're going to look at some more. There's a few other, there's some terminology that's also in the Old Testament that we haven't gotten to yet, that also is physical form stuff. And you by the end, hopefully you'll be like, man, Jesus is showing up all over the place. Yeah, he is. He really is. And so we'll look at how all of these really find their fulfillment in the incarnation, the taking on of not just a body like an appearance, actual human nature, fusing the God, Most High God, the commander of the Lord's armies, fusing himself with a second nature, the incarnation. But in the meantime, as we think about that, I want us to just reflect upon this week, this idea that the invisible God himself makes himself visible, that this transcendent one makes himself immanent, that the God who he said to dwell in unapproachable light is the language that's used, he comes down and wrestles with Jacob in the dirt. Wow. He speaks from bushes and he stands ready for battle. But the same truth on all of these is, again, we don't serve a disinterested deity who, again, manages from afar, watching me from afar. That's not the biblical God. Rather, it's one who shows up for the wrestling matches in the burning bushes and appears with sword in his hand for battles that need to be fought. And this angel of Yahweh, who appeared throughout the Old Testament, he was prepping the world for the ultimate appearance, when God would come not just in a temporary way, but he comes, what's the word that we always use at Christmas time? We call him Emmanuel, right? Which means God with us. He has come to be with us. That gives me great hope that I serve a God who insists on moving into the neighborhood, who insists on coming close, who says, I want to be with you. That's the God we serve.